Um, yeah, we don't have so much time together today, and I understand a number of people have to leave at 1 o'clock to go to work. Is that right? Yeah. So if I just keep talking to 1 o'clock, then none of you will have opportunity to ask any questions. So I think probably better if I don't talk for too long, and so that everyone can has opportunity to ask things that might be more relevant and useful for you. So my teacher, Ajahn Jayasaro, forbid his disciples from preparing public talks. So we just have to talk about whatever comes up at when we sit in front of an audience. And so I was asked to come up with a title for the talk today. So the title is like, it depends on whatever I can think of talking about today. But also the word it depends fortunately also sums up an essential strand, or even could argue the heart of the Buddha's teachings, because wisdom is understanding how things depend upon each other. So in some mystical teachings, there's this idea of this kind of interconnected web of being. In the Theravada school, we talk more about specific conditionality. What are the specific conditions that lead to progress? The specific conditions that lead to decline, the specific conditions that lead to suffering, specific conditions that lead to freedom from suffering. And so this is something perhaps I'd like to talk about a little. Let's take maybe I'll just quote the Buddha himself here, where the Buddha was asked a question about other religious traditions. And he said that if you do not closely observe the way that phenomena arise according to causes and conditions, then you can formulate a concept of annihilation. That is to say, for instance, that when you die, that's the end of everything. So that kind of view was prevalent in the time of the Buddha. And he said that similarly, if you don't closely observe the way that things change and pass away and disappear through causes and conditions, then you can create concepts of eternal hell and eternal heaven. But that a close examination and observation of the way things are prevents those two extreme views from arising in the mind. So that's one of the classic expressions of this specific conditionality as taught by the Buddha. So in the realm of ethics and morality, then we can be in the Western world, I think, familiar with this kind of punitive idea of a set of laws laid down which we should follow. If we do, we'll get a reward. If we don't, we'll be punished. So in the Buddhist tradition, we start off with a question. And say, what is the optimum condition for living together as human beings in families, in communities, in societies? What causes and conditions do we need to cultivate to bring about that optimum way of living together. So the Buddha's answer here is that most fundamental need of human beings is safety, need to feel safe. So how do we, practically speaking, go about creating safe environments? And the Buddha referred to the human nature, as in all of his teachings, and made a distinction that in the realm of action and speech, we can use the tool of intention or willpower. We cannot use that tool in the inner world. For instance, we may become inspired with spiritual teachings and decide that we would like to live with loving kindness and forgiveness for all beings. That's going to be my life principle in future. But if someone was to say, I will never get angry with anyone ever again, I'm just going to be kind and loving, then before very long at all, you realize that that's not possible, because you don't understand the causes and conditions that lead to non-anger. But what you can do, as a decision or as a promise, is to say to the people around you, look, I still get angry every now and again. Even though I love you, sometimes I find you really irritating. And sometimes even I can even want to hit you. I get so angry with you. So this is something that I'm working upon. But in the meantime, I promise you that I will never physically or verbally abuse you under any circumstances. Now, that to me is a practical, realistic approach. You're not being too idealistic. You're recognizing that there are still these negative mental states in your mind, but you are making use of this tool that you have, that you're born with as a human being, the decision to not do certain things, to create voluntary boundaries for your action and speech. And similarly, you can say, I still have greed in my heart. I see beautiful things, cool stuff, and I want those things. But I promise you that I will never act upon those feelings. You say you have a partner, and you say, I love you very much, but every now and again, I must admit, I see other people, other men, other women, I find them sexually attractive, find them beautiful, I find them handsome. This is the my heart is at this level at this moment. This is a normal unenlightened condition, but I will never act upon those feelings. I will never communicate those feelings to someone else. So how do you feel when someone says that somebody will never take anything of yours, somebody will never cheat on you? Not saying that I never look at another man or another woman in my life, you're the only one. That it's not realistic. Maybe, when you're first in love it works, but after a while I don't think so. But you can be honest and be realistic. Say, yeah, those feelings arise and pass away. I just don't give them any importance. I'm never going to act upon them. And so when someone makes those kind of commitments, you feel safe. You feel, you can relax. Someone says, I have the impulse to lie sometimes because I'm embarrassed or because I want something or I want to get rid of something or I just can't be bothered to go into the whole truth of things, etc., etc. But I won't do that. There are certain things that are private that I maybe not tell you, but I won't keep secrets. So we make a distinction between the private and the secret. I won't keep secrets, but I might have things that are private. But I won't lie to you. Now, with those 4 promises and commitments, you have the causes and conditions for a very harmonious life in a family or in a community. But if you don't keep the 5th precept and refraining from alcohol and drugs of any kind, then those promises cannot be relied upon. They can't be trusted in the same way because they undermine your sense of right and wrong and your sense of restraint. And you find that you can do all these things that you promise not to do under the influence of alcohol and drugs. And so as a means, as a cause and a condition to strengthen and make clear your absolute sincerity in making these promises, you refrain from taking any substance which will undermine your ability to keep those promises. So this is how we create atmosphere of safety in families and communities and trust. And this is a fundamental building block of human happiness, particularly living in society. Buddhist teachings, I think, over the years, because of the emphasis on the transformational tools that are present in the Buddhist tradition that tend to be lacking in Western culture, then so much emphasis put on mindfulness that Buddhism can even be seen to be rather solipsistic or too focused upon individual spiritual progress. But if you go to the primary source, to the Buddhist discourses themselves, or into Buddhist communities, you'll find that this is not at all the case. And in fact, the word Buddhism, you may be aware, is a much later coinage that the Buddha himself referred to his teachings as the Dhamma Vinaya. So the Dhamma are all those teachings dealing with the inner world, and the Vinaya refers to all the ways in which we create external conditions that promote and support the practice of Dhamma. So if you're living in a if you're living in a very unsafe environment, whether it's unsafe outside your house or even worse, unsafe within your house, then even if you have access to the most profound spiritual technologies, you're unlikely to really be able to benefit from them because the fundamentals are not in place. And if you're not giving some wise attention to what you eat, how much you eat, how much you rest, how much exercise you take, all these basic life skills, which unfortunately even most intelligent people can often be quite lax with, then similarly it has a knock-on effect and it adversely affects the meditation practice. So the more that you look, the more closely you examine this, you'll see that meditation is not something that can be extracted from the whole way you live your life. So my teacher put great emphasis on this through what we call the threefold training of action and speech, which we call sila, of the heart, which we call samadhi, and of the wisdom faculty, which is wisdom, and to point out that they are inseparable. So to keep those precepts that I spoke about just now, those promises to the people around you, then it has to be voluntary. So in Buddhism, if someone refrains from hurting and harming and stealing and adultery and all these things because they're afraid of going to prison or they're afraid of being ostracized or treated with contempt, then they would not be considered to be virtuous people or to have this quality of sila, this training of body and speech. It has to be voluntary. And if the Buddha says that if you keep precepts, so you don't kill and steal and abuse, you don't commit adultery, etc., but on the basis of that, you start to consider yourself better or superior to other people who don't keep that standard, then your morality is tarnished. And the Buddha said, you're not a sage, you're a fool. So it's not simply a matter of following rules in a very robotic kind of way. There's a lot more involved. And then even if we do take on these standards that I've spoken about, we can see that various mental training, areas of mental training are necessary to make it effective. Most fundamentally, mindfulness practice. Now, mindfulness is very popular these days, and there are many different understandings of what that word means, and the Buddhist understanding not quite the same as the secular mindfulness understanding, but that's a separate topic. The point I would like to make here is that being in the present moment is not a goal in itself. It's a condition for this education to take place. So I like to look on present moment as a classroom. So this is really like where you really do the learning about yourself, the human condition, what causes suffering, what eliminates suffering, what leads to progress, what leads to regress. You can only really study these effectively when you're in the classroom at the present moment. But being in the present moment is not doesn't mean that you can't think of the past and the present, the future. So, for instance, whenever we have any kind of task, then inevitably we have to draw upon our past experience to be effective. So being in the present moment just doesn't mean cutting off all memory, but it means judiciously drawing upon useful and appropriate information that we have accumulated in the past. So you're aware of memory as memory, in other words, not becoming identified with memory. Similarly, with thoughts of the future, even fully enlightened beings, they're in the present moment all the time, but they still have to book plane tickets ahead of time, and they have to plan their schedules just like anybody else. So being in the present moment is not this kind of this bubble in which you're no longer aware of the past and the future, but you're aware of memory as memory, as thought, emotion as emotion. You're aware of things for what they are, not adding on to them, or not excuse me, not filtering them through the through desires and fears and expectation and so on. So in the present moment is where you have the opportunity to learn what's what. And this is why it's so important to develop the skill to be present to your experience. And meditation, mindfulness is of what's going on in the body, what's going on in the mind, what's going on around. It's an awakened quality. And let's say in the case of anger, that, let's say, going back to what I speaking about just now, you make a promise to the people around you that I will not abuse you physically or verbally. But if your anger becomes too strong, then you can forget your promise also. So you need to have this mindfulness, which means that when the first tremors, when the mind just starts to lose its balance, you are aware of the patterns of sensation in the body which always accompany the first intimations of anger. And you look and you observe and you remember these patterns of sensation, particularly physical sensation, which are signals that if you're not careful, anger is going to take over your mind. And so you can deal with these things very easily when they are just starting to pop up in the mind before they become like full-blown anger. So this is how mindfulness works. And we spend inevitably, because there's so much going on all the time, we do put a lot of our daily actions onto the realm of automatic pilot. But having precepts, for instance, as pegs for mindfulness, then let's say, like in Thailand, we have a lot of bugs and mosquitoes. Let's say a mosquito is about to bite you, and you have an automatic pilot program, which you just slap the mosquito. But then if you've taken a precept not to harm, to kill you, and you take it seriously, then perhaps in the moment that you're reaching to swat that mosquito, you remember, no, I've taken a precept not to harm. So at that moment, you've woken up. That you express your humanity, because the moment you wake up and you're in the present moment, you ask yourself, what am I doing? Do I really want to do this? Is this the only choice that I have? Is there a better way of dealing with this problem? Is my action in harmony with my aspirations? So wisdom and investigation, contemplation, ethical standards all appear dependent upon, conditioned upon this moment of waking up to what you're doing in real time. And the tool that enables you to do that is the mindfulness. But mindfulness is not just like this kind of floating quality of being mindful. Mindfulness, to be effective, has to have specific objects. You have to be mindful of something. So if you're mindful of a commitment, not to kill, not to harm, the mind wakes up, and then you have choices. Without mindfulness, you just follow the same old patterns of habit and instinct, and prejudice. So you need mindfulness, loving kindness also. The more that you develop this all-embracing kindness for those around you, for all living beings, then the likelihood of you even having the impulse to hurt and to harm is much reduced. Perhaps most importantly, and the Buddha certainly gave great importance to, patient endurance, what we call khanti. The Buddha says that patient endurance is the supreme incinerator of defilement. Excuse me. So maybe you have an impulse to harm or to hurt or to say something nasty. You recollect that it's against your precept. You wake up But sometimes the momentum is such that if you lack patient endurance, then your mind will just override that, and you will act and say things that you will regret afterwards. So that ability just to be with the unpleasant is a really essential life skill. So this is the meaning of I think of patient endurance that we can apply is like peaceful coexistence with the unpleasant. You have an emotion, you have a feeling of discomfort, and a natural tendency is to want to push it away or to turn your back on it, to get free of it. You feel oppressed by it. But with patient endurance, you don't repress it, you don't run away from it, you don't indulge it, you just allow it to be there. Make friends with it. It's just to be with it and realize that you can coexist with the unpleasant without feeling oppressed by it. So these are elements of the mental training. This mental training is given the word samadhi, its title is samadhi, but this is not the samadhi which we find in the Eightfold Path, meaning a state of concentration. It's an umbrella term for this whole training of the heart. But samadhi is, in the sense of inner calm, clarity, stability, is also an extremely important and wonderful quality to develop. Because the mind that's constantly looking outside of itself and grasping onto things is basically a mind which feels a sense of lack. And it's samadhi which effectively removes that sense of lack. You have a sense of inner sufficiency, that and something that can be accessed at any time. So when we want to get something, the assumption is that we will be improved by that thing, or that thing will take away a state that we don't want to have to feel. And the normal mental state or the normal belief is that basically better the devil you know than the devil you don't. So it means to say that you get addicted to all kinds of behaviors and things that you kind of know are not providing you with the happiness that you hoped for, but you can't let them go because you think, well, if I didn't have this, I wouldn't have anything. And this is, I think, a very fundamental condition on which unwholesome and unskillful and foolish behaviors thrive. This sense that it's not so good, I don't feel so happy about it, but if I didn't have this, I wouldn't have anything. So developing inner calm, you just feel that you don't actually need all this stuff, and you can still pursue pleasures in the world and worldly success. It's not that you just give up on all those things, but you're not neurotic about it anymore, and you're not. And in the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because you have access to this inner happiness, independent of conditions. So this is a wonderful thing to be able to create within you and to sustain. So this is the way that the outer and the inner are constantly nourishing each other. For instance, just now I mentioned the value of developing thoughts of loving kindness for all beings as a regular practice, and it will affect your conduct. But similarly, merely by refraining from harming even the smallest creatures or even nasty creatures or things that frighten you means that every time that impulse to harm arises in your mind, you don't follow it, and therefore you don't feed it. And after a while, it starts to atrophy. If you consistently refuse to feed an intention, it becomes very, very weak. Although it may not disappear altogether, it becomes so weak as to be almost non-existent. So this is the way that the practice of precepts is itself a spiritual practice. It deals with inner imbalances and unwholesome negative mental states. But in the case of anger, to give a kind of leading example, these inner trainings of mindfulness, of loving kindness, of patience, of samadhi or meditation, in conjunction with using the power of willpower to create boundaries for actions and speech, is still not enough to purify the mind of anger, because anger is always based upon certain cravings, certain ideas, certain thoughts, which have to be brought up into the light, examined, and abandoned. So the Buddha pointed out in the Four Noble Truths that whenever we suffer, there is always some craving involved. In other words, nobody, nothing, no thing, no person can make you suffer. External conditions, people around you can inflict physical pain upon you and can make your life very difficult. But whether or not you suffer or not, the cause of suffering is within. The conditions, the supporting conditions for suffering can be outside. So the Buddha's not saying just deal with the inner cause and whatever the outer conditions are, just forget about them. You have to deal with both. So if someone's behaving in an immoral way and trying to hurt you, your inner practice is to let go of the causes of suffering, but externally you may have to deal with that. You may have to call the police, or you may have to go and speak with that person, or whatever it might be. So the inner and the outer practice have to be conducted in conjunction. The inner practice, seeing, is that when somebody acts in a certain way, the actual suffering is because we don't want them to act in that way, or we feel we shouldn't be treated in that way, or we deserve better than that, or we want something and that person is not giving it to us, or they're giving something else that we don't want. So there is always this element of craving within the mind, which is the root cause of our suffering, but not the root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem, includes the actions of others and the external environment. So an overall strategy has to deal with both. But what you can take personal responsibility for is the cause of suffering within, and abandon that. Say, well, yeah, why is that person so nasty and so horrible to me, cruel and nasty? Well, because of causes and conditions. Because that person thinks that way, because that person has those habits and those prejudices, because of the environment. There are so many causes and conditions that lead to that kind of behavior. So when you deconstruct what's going on, rather than him or her and me, and you look at it in terms of conditions and dependencies, then you take the poison out of it. And you realize, you think, yeah, they're behaving really badly, but because their mind is consumed with anger or with jealousy, and then instead of thinking, what a bad person, or what a terrible person that is, you think, oh, it's just so, isn't it terrible when isn't jealousy a terrible thing? When jealousy takes over someone's mind, it makes them do the most horrible things. When greed takes over someone's mind, look what it does to them. So when you're shifting from the mental factors which are behind this person's behavior, you're not, just trying to develop some kind of positive thinking. You're looking at what's actually going on. And you realize that a lot of the heat goes out of it, and you become aware of what you can do and what you can't do. And you become accepting of the situation in those areas that you can't do anything. If you're a practicing Buddhist or a meditator, maybe you have a bad temper or an anger, and you think, I've been working on this for years, and I'm still not making much headway. So how could I expect someone who's never even considered meditation to be any better at it than I am? So these are the kinds of reflections that you can have. So this is the role of what we call wise reflection. And then when the mind is being developed through meditation to have a very clear, stable awareness, then you can look at the arising and passing away of the emotion of anger, and to see its selfless nature in a very direct, non-discursive way, and let go of it altogether. That's, of course, a very difficult thing to do. So this threefold training or education includes meditation, but it's not restricted to meditation or confined to meditation. It means taking on a whole education of how you act in the world, how you treat the people around you, of your emotional well-being, and the way that you look at the world and the way that you understand yourself. So that's I'd like to end the talk at this point so that there'll be some possibility of questions and answers.